Bruchim Habayim, welcome those who come in the name of the Lord. It's great to have you with us here this Friday night. When we look at the Parsha, we can understand something which spans much further than this week's actual double Torah reading. And this week we read both Bahar Bechukotai, which is a double Parsha, which is the end of the book of Leviticus. And within it we read something which doesn't necessarily sound too relevant to us today, but I think is relevant in meaning as well as in agriculture, and that is about the Shemitah. And what is the Shemitah? Agriculturally, every 7th year, we're supposed to allow the land to rest. Religiously in Israel, there are places, of course, that on the 7th year, they do let the land rest. And you'd ask the question, well, how do they have food for that 7th year? Well, that is taken care of in a double parsha on the 6th year. Just like when the children of Israel were in the desert, they received a double portion of man on Friday, so on Saturday they did not need to collect it. But even more so, it's showing on one hand that we understand God's creations is everything around us. If you look at the video that I'm now taping, you can see the greenery, the beauty of nature behind us, and that is, once again, also God's creation. So we have to see everything. If we're having the Shemitah, we're letting the land to rest. We're in essence allowing God's holiness to rejuvenate itself within the land. But what's also important is the Shemitah is the 7th year. And the number 7, which is important both to Judaism as well as to society. Because if we look at the number 7, 7, of course, is the holiness because God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. So the day of Shabbat is Lishbot, which means to cease. So we cease, we go on strike. A Shvita in modern Hebrew is a strike. So we rest on that day, but the number 7, of course, is not only the number of days God created and rested. 7 is the 7th year of the Shemitah. Between Passover, Pesach, and Shavuot, which we're counting down, you have 7 weeks, 49 days plus the 50th day, which is Shavuot. But if you also look around us today, I would ask you how many musical notes there are. And if you answered 7, you'd be correct. If I was to ask you how many seas there are, if you were to ask actually how many oceans there are, you would say 7. If I was to ask you how many continents there are, and you said 7, you would be correct. So let's look at that for a second. We know that 7 has holiness in terms of Judaism, but 7, if you look at it as the continents, as the musical notes, the water, we can understand it also has holiness. And when they were trying to organize the world, they wanted to organize it once again on the holiness of the Torah. So what is the 7 continents? We can understand that as each place, each continent, the people within the continent are holy in and of themselves. If I was to say, and I say this many times, B'Tselem Elohim Nivra Adam, in God's image man was created, we can see that by the 7, we have the holiness. By the water, the 7, once again, at one point there was a belief that God only controlled the land, that the water was not in God's control. That's why we have the story of Jonah and the whale, showing that God controls the water as well. So we have here the 7 to show that God is everywhere. And also we know that music brings about spirituality. It brings God's voice in many ways into our hearts through the beauty that music is made or played through the talents that the musician receives from God. So we see here that the holiness of the Shemitah is in essence something much larger. It's the holiness of life. It is the holiness of God's creation, and it is a holiness that we perpetuate God's creation with. Let's take Neil Gilman, who said that the only thing revealed at Revelation was Revelation itself. It would say that we are the partners in the continuing creation. Thereby, I think we need to remember not necessarily the number 7 in everything we do, but we have to remember the holiness that is in everything there is. For if we understand this, then when we read the words at the end of the Torah portion, which we say, Chazak, Chazak, v'nitchazek, may you be strong, and may you have strength, it will even have more meaning, because the strength will be everything around us. And when we realize that, all of us will be strong. Let me wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom, a good end of this week's Parsha and the book of Leviticus. And when we start the book of Bamidbar, which means in the desert, but we call it the book of Numbers because it counts all the Israelites, may we all be numbered among those who believe and bring God's holiness into this world. Shabbat Shalom.
As we've been doing since Pesach, it's time to count the Omer. I am ready to fulfill the mitzvah of counting the Omer, as it is ordained in the Torah. You shall count from the eve of the 2nd day of Pesach, when an Omer of grain is to be brought as an offering 7 complete weeks. The day after the 7th week of your counting will make 50 days. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu asfirat haomer. Hayom Shiva u'shloshim yom la'omer, shehem 5 shavuot u'shnei yamim la'omer. Today makes 37 days of counting the Omer, and that is 5 weeks and 2 days, the 22nd of Iyar. I'd like to share with you now the names of all those whose yortzites are being observed today, May 15th, the 21st of Iyar. Rabbi Theodore Brod, Sarah Carr, Ray Krug-Katz, Louis Lusky, Seymour Perchanok, Bernard Philip Rosen, and Elizabeth Zeph Rubin, and Jacob Zaid. Please forgive me if I've mispronounced any of those names. May their memories all be as a blessing. El Male Rachamim, Shochen Bamramim, Hametzeh Melcha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Hashkina, B'mahalo Kiroshim Utorim, Kezohar Harakia, Mazhirim. Lenishmot Shekol Ele Shehalchu La'olamam, Began Eden Tehei Menuchatam, Ahana Ba'al Harachamim, Astirem B'seit Knafecha La'olamim, Utzrar Bitzrar HaChaim Et Nishmotehem, Adonai Hu Nachalatam, V'yanuchu B'shalom Al Mishkavotehem, V'nomar Amen. All those who are observing a yortzeit or in mourning, please join me in the words of the mourner's Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'izman kariv yamaru amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevorach, לעולם עולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמה ויאמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן.